Hey everyone, happy week 3. So this week we are going to do a deep dive of the consulting industry. Our presenters today are myself, Naharika, as well as Mook, Shivani, and Angel. So a little bit of an outline of what we're going to be going through today. We're going to start off with a brief intro to consulting, followed by a deep dive into the case interview. Then we're going to move into a mock case. We're going to walk through it together, and feel free to pause it throughout to check yourself and maybe follow along with us. Then we're going to provide some tips and resources for casing should you want to explore that further. And lastly, we'll have a short discussion of the recruitment timeline for consulting. So first, we're going to start off with an intro to consulting.
So to begin with, what exactly is consulting? Consulting is the business of solving complicated problems and providing expert solutions for clients in a professional or technical field. So to simplify it a little bit, it's essentially the business of providing professional advice. So this is a varied field, so there are different types of consulting that one should be aware of. First up, we have management consulting. Management consultants are experts who are trained to solve complex problems, devise invaluable strategies, and improve the financial and operational health of their client's organization. Next up, we have strategy and operations. Strategy consultants primarily analyze business practices and goals and make suggestions for improvements or company direction in the long run. So that is a defining factor in terms of what separates strategy consultants from other types of consultants, is that they do focus on strategies to help the business, to basically better the business in the long run. Next up, we have human capital. And so these consultants are involved in the planning of strategic activities, often managed such as performance management, professional development, and human resources planning and measurement. Technology consulting is also another really popular field within consulting. Technology consulting is about understanding what clients want to achieve for their business and advising on how they can use their IT to deliver those business outcomes. So technology consultants work with clients to help them transform the way they use their technology. And lastly, we have industry-specific and niche consulting. So under each of these types of consulting, you'll find a short list of firms who do specialize in that specific type of consulting. So to every job, there's always going to be some pros and some cons. So let's go ahead and start off with some of the pros of consulting. First things first, there is a lot of flexibility in terms of when you get to meet and work with your clients. This also kind of ties in with the second bullet point where it says every day is different. This quality is greatly appreciated by people who tend to not like regular 9-to-5 desk jobs, and that's because you're meeting with different clients every single day, you're solving different problems every single day, so this is a great route for people who don't necessarily like routine jobs. Another really cool thing about consulting is the team environment you get to experience. Consultants typically get to work in a team with either their colleagues or possibly even management. You get the chance to collaborate with the team, which is also another quality greatly appreciated by consultants. You get the chance to enhance problem-solving analytical skills daily because that's what your job entails as a consultant at the end of the day. Oftentimes, you're required to analyze data and reports and come up with a fitting solution. The consulting field allows for big growth opportunities, where you get to experience professional growth early on in your career. Many consultants find that the next promotion is only 1 or 2 years away, which is so cool. Another nice thing is that no specific degree is required to do well in this field. There's a common misconception that certain degrees lead to a narrow choice of jobs, but this is not at all the case when it comes to consulting. You also get the opportunity to build a powerful network as a consultant. This is because consultants tend to work in a team environment with skilled and talented individuals who share the same passions as you. This gives you the chance to build a lifelong network that can help you reach powerful heights. And last but not least, you're highly compensated for the work you do as a consultant. It's what they always say, good advice doesn't come cheap. Although there are many pros as part of being a consultant, there are some cons that one should be aware of before entering the field. First things first, you could experience really long hours. Some weeks you'll be working 60+ hours a week, and that's pretty common for a typical consultant. Another thing to be mindful of is that travel can be really extensive. You could be flying out of an airport for weeks on end, and you could be moving between places constantly for your clients. Another downside is that you could be assigned to projects where you don't have any interest or knowledge about. So there might be times throughout your career where you're working more to gain more knowledge about your case, but you might not be that interested in it. The duration of your project can vary a lot as well. Sometimes your cases only require you to be active for a couple of weeks, whereas others might require your dedication for months on end. And this can be a challenge to constantly change between different timelines. Being a consultant can be really stressful and intense due to the strict deadlines and pressure to deliver good results, so this can be a challenge as well for people who don't necessarily work well or efficiently under stress. And finally, with the relatively high turnover of staff, you could have more work on your plate to make up for their work without necessarily receiving a boost, which can be unfortunate at times.
Next, we're going to move into a deep dive of the case interview.
Hi everyone, it's Angel. Thanks for tuning in. We hope this is helpful. So what is a case interview? A case interview is an interview where you are asked to solve a business problem. The problem reflects a challenge that real consultants could help their clients overcome. It's basically a simulation of a project that a consultant would work on. In a case interview, your interviewer is looking for number 1, the approach you take to solving a problem. So, how your mind processes a challenge. Number 2, how analytical and creative your thinking is. Interviewers want insight on not just what you think, but also how you think. Number 3, your usage of data to quantify and make your recommendations. There will often, if not always, be numbers in some way, shape, or form in your case. For example, your case could involve math calculations or interpreting graphs, charts, or tables, which are called exhibits. Number 4, your communication skills in conveying your ideas. Consulting is a client-facing profession, so the way in which you present your ideas is just as important as what your ideas are. Your interviewer is looking for clear, concise, and confident language. Number 5, how you would suggest implementing these proposals. Are you able to solve the case? Is your solution specific to the business problem at hand? Also, some cases have multiple objectives, so make sure you meet all of them. So, what's the purpose of such a daunting interview? The first is to see if you're curious. Be inquisitive and identify the business problems that your client is facing. The purpose of a consultant is to be like a doctor for a business's illness, but the first step to a solution is to identify the problems themselves and figure out what's causing them. The second is to test your analytical ability and how you process information. The third purpose is to see if you're able to take all of that information given and organize it in a logical manner, in a way that your clients will understand. The fourth purpose is closely related to the third purpose, to see how you think and see if you can calmly sort through everything presented. The fifth purpose is to see how you would react in a stressful situation if you were to become a consultant. Clients could get frustrated or angry, but it's extremely important to remain poised and confident no matter how the project is going. The sixth purpose is to see if you enjoy problem solving. Consultants solve problems every day, so it's important to enjoy it. The seventh purpose is to determine if you and consulting are fit for each other. Now that we've discussed the definition and purpose of a case interview, let's get into the case itself. There are different types of questions you could be asked in a case interview. Topics that could be covered include, but are not limited to, entering a new market. For example, Angel's Coffee currently only sells coffee drinks. They're considering selling food as well. Should they move forward? Industry analysis. For example, your client could be Angel's Cupcakes, and you could be presented with information on the cupcake market. You could be asked, is Angel's Cupcakes a strong player in the cupcake market? Mergers and acquisitions. For example, our client, Angel's Gowns, is a high-end maker and manufacturer for wedding dresses. However, it's having trouble securing high-quality fabric in time to meet the demand for the gowns. Angel's Gowns is considering buying Amy's Fabric, an Italian-based high-end fabric company. Is this a good idea? And other topics could include developing a new product, pricing strategies, growth strategies, starting a new business, competitive response, increasing sales, reducing costs, improving the bottom line, and profits. Another thing to keep in mind is that a case interview could include any combination of these questions, especially in longer cases. For example, one case could involve industry analysis, growth strategies, and competitive response. Now let's get into how to tackle a case. First, your interviewer gives you the prompt, which includes some background information and the business's problems. However, your interviewer won't give you all the information right off the bat because they want to see if you can ask clarifying questions that will help you solve the case. Second, ask for a few moments to develop a framework to solve the case. Try to keep this brainstorming under 1 minute. This is basically your roadmap, so you want to make it organized and thorough. We'll get into the specifics in the next slide. Third, you want to develop a hypothesis of what you think the solution could potentially be. Fourth, test the hypothesis. This is the step that you'll spend most of your case on. Try to synthesize all the information you've been given in a way that keeps driving the case forward towards the solution. Always keep the objective in mind. Lastly, give the final recommendation. You'll know that your case is wrapping up if your interviewer says something like, "The CEO has just walked in and wants to know what you've come up with so far." In your final recommendation, make sure you include a few key components: the recommendation, support, risks, and next steps. Your final recommendation is a great opportunity for you to drive the case home or push it over the edge if your interviewer is on the fence. Don't be afraid to get creative in this part too. You just made it through the whole case and now you're talking to the CEO, so present your recommendation confidently. You got this.
Okay, so now let's look at the different types of frameworks that you can utilize when tackling a case. There's a few types of framework as listed below that you're going to be able to learn. For example, market sizing, profitability, growth strategy, and the rest is listed on the slide, and we're going to go over all of them today. However, when you're actually casing for a consulting internship, don't just go in and memorize and replicate perfectly these frameworks, because a lot of times your interviewer can tell if you're actually thinking about the case at hand that they've presented to you or not, or if you're just memorizing based off the frameworks that you've learned. So once you've mastered it, you should kind of mix and match these frameworks and use it as fit depending on the case. Okay, so now we're going to look at market sizing. Generally, there are two ways to look at market sizing. So that would be the top-down approach or the bottom-up approach. And we're just going to start with top-down approach. And the top-down approach, as the name suggests, you start big and filter it down smaller and smaller to find your end number. So for example, if you get a question for market sizing that asks you to estimate the number of new car tires sold in LA per year. So what you would do with this is you would start big. You would think, okay, how many people are there in the LA County? And with that, you know that there are 10 million people in the LA County. And then with that, you start filtering it down to see and estimate how many households there are in LA. So if you assume that on average, the average household size is 4 people, you would divide 10 million by 4 to get 2.5 million households in the LA County area. And then after that, you would kind of filter it down even further to kind of examine how many cars on average does each household have. And for simplicity's sake, we're just going to assume that each household has 2 cars. So we would multiply 2.5 million households with 2 cars to get 5 million cars in LA. In actuality, the better approach would be segmenting it in income brackets, but just so that the calculation is easier this time around, we're just going to ignore that. But when you're doing an actual case, do income segmentation. And then after we get that 5 million cars in the LA County, we're filtering it down even further, and we're going to start thinking about what the car replacement rate is going to be. So how often do people buy new cars in LA? So if we assume that the replacement rate of cars is 10 years, people change their cars every 10 years, we would divide 5 million by 10 years to get 500K new cars being bought per year in LA County. And with this 500K new cars per year, we're going to multiply this by 4 tires per car to get 2 million tires being sold in the LA area. So this is how you would approach kind of a top down. You start big and then you filter it down and down and down. And just so you know, this calculation is very simple. We've excluded a lot of things, but this is just to show you guys how you would approach a top-down market sizing case. So now let's move on to the second market sizing approach, which is bottoms up. And bottoms up is exactly the opposite of top down. So you start small and then you think big later on. So for example, if you're presented with a market sizing question of what's the yearly revenue for Blue Bottle coffee, you would start by estimating the daily revenue of Blue Bottle per store, like for a single store. So in order to get that number of revenue for a single store per day, you would look at things such as operation hours. How many hours do they operate? So, for example, that would be 10 hours per day. And then you would segment those operating hours into peak and non-peak hours and kind of use based off your experience how many hours you think is going to be peak hour and how many hours you think are going to be non-peak hours. So for here, we're just going to assume that Blue Bottle has 3 peak hours per operating day and 7 non-peak hours. After that, you start thinking about what's the maximum capacity of customers that Blue Bottle coffee can handle per day in that single store. So if we assume that we can serve 1 customer per minute per register, in an hour we know that we can serve 60 customers, and in a day we know that we can serve maximum 600 customers per register. So since you have that maximum numbers of customers that Blue Bottle can serve per day, you now have to think about utilization and capacity for peak and non-peak hours. So for example, now you just kind of have to make your own assumptions, and if you think during peak hours Blue Bottle is going to be utilized, like going to be at full capacity, serving customers 100% of the time, or if they're going to be serving customers 80% of the time. And for non-peak hours, you make the same assumption. How often do you think customers are coming by? Do you think they're only serving at 20%, the maximum capacity per hour, or what? Just use logic to back that up. And then with that, you calculate the number of customers that come through to Blue Bottle per day. And then moving on, you kind of estimate or come up with the average spend per customer. And usually for like a coffee shop here, it's $5 per customer. You multiply the number of customers per day at 1 single store in Blue Bottle that you calculated previously to the average spend per person to get the total revenue of Blue Bottle per day. And after that, you can kind of multiply and work from there. After you get the revenue from a single store per day, you just multiply that by the number of stores Blue Bottle has, and then you multiply that by the number of days to get the yearly revenue. So that's how you would approach a bottoms-up market sizing. You would think about the single store and work from like looking at the small portion and then working your way upwards. So that's an example of a bottoms-up market sizing case. Now that we've learned more about the different market sizing approaches, let's move on to learn more about the different frameworks that you can employ. So first, we're just going to look at the profitability framework. Even though this may seem simple, this is definitely one of the most important frameworks that you should be on top of, since the majority of the cases that you'll encounter will have at least some form of profitability ingrained in it. So we know that profitability is simply equals profit is just simply revenue minus cost. And breaking revenues down, revenue is made up of price times volume, while cost is made up of variable costs and fixed costs. So if you're presented with a case that asks you to find ways to increase profits, some of the things that you should definitely be keeping in mind or asking the interviewers about is just, for example, on the revenue side, you should be thinking about what the different revenue streams are and finding out what the percentage of total revenue does each stream represent. You want to understand if there's been any changes in those percentages lately, and if that is the case, you also want to understand why and what you can do to change that if possible. On the revenue side, you can kind of increase revenues through multiple of ways. For example, you can increase volume, and this is possible by expanding into new areas, reducing prices, possibly increasing marketing and sales force, or improving customer services. or maybe depending on if your goods is inelastic or elastic, you can change price in order to increase your revenue too. Moving on to the cost side, some of the important considerations that you should be thinking about and definitely asking the interviewers about are kind of understanding what the major costs are for the firm that you're working with, and to see if there's been any major cost shifts within the past few years or recently. You want to see if these costs look out of line or not, and you can do that by kind of looking at what percentage of these costs represent the total cost. Or you could also do this by benchmarking those costs against competitors. And from there on, you can brainstorm ways to reduce costs and see, or potentially ask the interviewers if, is it possible to reduce this fixed cost or variable cost? And then you would work from there. So this is the profitability framework, and just keep those things in the back of your mind when approaching a profitability case. So moving on to growth strategy, if you're presented with a case that asks you to brainstorm ways for the company to grow, there are a few ways in order for you to do this. First, you could increase the company's distribution channels. By doing so, more of the product is out there in the market, and you're hoping that the sales volume is going to increase since your product now has a wider reach. Second is you can invest in marketing in hopes of improving sales volume. However, this is typically a more risky option just because it costs a lot of money, and you don't know if by doing your marketing campaign, the amount or like the volume of your product sales is going to increase or not. And it also takes a long time in order to see the effect of your marketing work. Third is you could increase product line, while fourth is you could diversify products and services. Increasing product line is different from diversifying products and services. Just so you all know, increasing product line typically means that, so it's when like a company creates a new product in the same product line of an existing brand. So for example, Coca-Cola, beforehand they only had the normal Coca-Cola, right? But then they increased their product line by creating Coke Zero, Coke Diet, or whatever. So that's an extension of their existing brand. While for diversifying products and services, diversification is when a firm enters a new market or industry different from its core business. So this is, for example, if like Coke decides to produce Clorox or like cleaning supplies. And the fifth way that you can grow is organically, and that is to acquire competitors. Moving on to pricing strategy. Sometimes you do get a case in which the interviewer asks you which pricing strategy would be best for the company. There are three pricing strategies that you can consider. First is through competitive analysis. And for this one, you'd be looking at what the competitors' prices are, what the substitute prices of your products look like, and then you'd be deciding your price based off your competitors, basically. The second type of pricing strategy is cost-based pricing. And in this type of pricing, you're basically looking at what it costs to produce your goods and what the break-even point looks like, and ideally what type of profit margin your company wants. So you'd be looking at things from a cost perspective, and then you decide your price based on those things. Third strategy is price-based costing. And in this type of pricing strategy, basically what you're looking at is you're looking at what customers are willing to pay for your product, and your price should be decided based on supply and demand. So those are the 3 different types of pricing strategies that you can consider when thinking about how you should price your goods. Okay, so moving on, we'll be looking at competition. So in this part, we'll be looking at what you should do if an interviewer presents you with a case that asks you for possible responses to the firm's comparator actions, basically. So in this part, first thing you should do is analyze the competition. You should be asking relevant questions like, so what did the competition do? If so, what has changed due to their actions? For example, are there any new products which they launched? And because of this, have they picked up market share? How has our position been affected? And if so, by how much? Next thing that you should be looking at after analyzing the competition is to come up with possible responses. So a few possible ways to combat competition or competitor action is, first, you can acquire the competitor. Second, you can merge with them. Third, you can copy them. Or fourth, you can increase your own profile with marketing. Or 5, you can hire competitors management. So those are some of the few possible responses that you can undertake if the competition does something that sabotages your market share or something like that. Lastly, we'll be going over the M&A framework. When asked if you think an M&A is a good idea to proceed with or not, there are essentially 4 major key areas in which you should consider. First, that is the market. Second, that's the target of the acquisition itself. Third, it's the buyer or your own firm. Fourth is the synergies and risks that could come with the acquisition. Looking at these different points in more detail, starting with the market. When looking at the market, you want to understand what the market size is for this industry and what the potential growth looks like in the future for the market. You also want to understand if the industry typically has a high profit margin or not, and then compare that with the target acquisition firm that you're looking at. You also want to see if the industry is competitive or not, and if it has a high barrier to entry or low barrier to entry. And lastly, you want to keep in mind any regulations that there may be within that industry or market. Moving on to the target. When looking at the target of acquisition, there are a few things that you should consider. First, you want to understand if they're in good financial standing currently. You also want to see if there is any rooms for future improvements or growth in the future. Second, you want to know what the assets are, what their competency areas are, what their competitive advantage is, and what their capabilities are. You also want to see what their management team looks like, if they're a good operator of the firm or not, or if they just think about the firm in the short run rather than the long run. You also want to make sure that the culture of the target firm is a good fit with your own firm's culture. Third, moving on to the buyer or your own firm, some of the key things that you want to know is you want to understand the rationale behind the M&A. You want to know why they're trying to buy this firm. You also want to see if we've had any previous experiences with buying another firm, and you want to see if the timing is right and if we have enough money to finance that acquisition. Lastly, you want to understand what the synergies and risks of that acquisition is going to look like. What's the probability of the merger or acquisition failing? And what are the implications of that? And how likely is that? You also want to see if the firm has any synergies, so if it's a good match with your own company or not. So that's the 4 key areas or things that you should be thinking about when considering an M&A. This is all the frameworks that we're going through today. The frameworks are a good starting point for you to kind of tackle a case, but when actually going into a case interview, actually think about the case at hand rather than using the memorized frameworks that you got, because the interviewers can see that and sense that. They want to know that you can think about the problem at hand yourself and solve that.
Next, we are going to walk through a mock case together. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and read the prompt. If you'd like to make this as real as possible, feel free to pause the video right now, get out a pen and paper, and maybe jot down what I'm saying rather than reading it off the screen. Because in a normal case interview, you're not going to have the prompt in front of you like this. An interviewer will be reading it out loud to you, and it's your job to write down as many relevant notes as possible. So let's begin. The prompt is, our client, Unicloth, is an Asian clothing retailer attempting to establish a profitable presence in the US. However, since they arrived 5 years ago, they have struggled to achieve that goal and have engaged our firm to find out why and to recommend next steps. How can we help? So now what we want to do, because this is a little bit open-ended, is we want to bucket areas to focus on. So for example, things that we might focus on are the product. So what do they sell? Where is it made? Is it the same thing that they sell in Asia? Next could be the market. How is the industry as a whole doing? How does competition differ in the United States from Asia? Next, revenue. What does their revenue look like? And of course, we know that revenue is broken down into price and units sold, so any more information on that would be relevant to finding out how we can help. And then of course, along with that is cost. So after you tell the interviewer these bucketed items, the interviewer will provide you with the following information. So about the product, this company sells casual clothing, and the items are manufactured in China and Bangladesh. In terms of the market, the retail market has been stable, and we don't have any other information on competitors. In terms of revenue, we know that the average product price is about $40 and that this is in line with mid-tier competitors. And so from this information, they'll probably just tell you this and then leave you hanging. And so what any consulting interviewer wants to see is the way you think, and they want to see you drive the case forward. And what that means is you lead the case in terms of what our next steps are. And so out loud, you probably want to say something like, maybe we want to look at profit analysis. We want to look at that revenue number, considering the product seems relatively in line with typical clothing items, and that the market has been relatively stable. Next, the interviewer asks you to market size the number of products sold per year, given that this company has 4 stores in the United States. So important things you want to jot down in your paper as the interviewer is telling you this is, first of all, per year. So we're estimating the number of products annually. The timeline is always very important for market sizing. Oftentimes it's where a lot of people trip up because they're looking at per day, per hour, something that the interviewer did not actually ask for. And then second, you want to note that they have 4 stores in the United States. So especially if you're taking an approach where you figure out the number of units sold for one store, you want to make sure you don't forget that they have 4 stores. So you're going to multiply whatever number you get by 4. And so typically what will happen after they ask you this general statement about market sizing is that you'll have to think for a minute and then go ask the interviewer yourself a few clarifying questions to help you along, or make the assumptions yourself. And so it never hurts to ask them, do we have any information on X, Y, and Z? So for example, that could be the number of hours the store is open each day, or how many items are sold per a certain amount of time. These are completely fine to ask your interviewer. A lot of the time they might turn around and say, let's have you estimate that for us. Maybe they won't have an exact number in front of them. And so they just want to see how you come up with a number that's reasonable and that has, some logic behind it. And so in this case, we do know that each store is open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day of the year, and that on average, one item is sold every 6 minutes in the store. So then from this information on paper, you would likely be performing the following calculations. So first of all, finding out the number of items per store per day. And so what you would do is you'd find out the number of items sold in an hour, which is 60 minutes divided by 6, multiplied by the number of hours that are sold in the day, giving you 120. Next, to find out the number of items sold per year, you would take that number you just got and multiply it by the number of days in a year. After that, find out the number of items sold from all of their stores per year. And remember, they have 4 stores. You just multiply whatever number you just got by 4. And so remember, you'll usually be doing all of these calculations on paper. Sometimes it's okay to ask the interviewer, is it okay if I round this up or down? For example, that 43,800, oftentimes an interviewer will be fine if you round it to 44,000. Just make sure that you ask them first before proceeding with something in case the numbers work out down the line and they don't want you to start rounding too early. And so after you find this number for the number of items sold for all stores per year, you can go ahead and find your annual revenue by using the $40 average product price that you were given in the previous slide and multiplying that by the number of items sold per all 4 stores per year you just found. And then at this point, the interviewer tells you that you can move forward with $7 million. So as you can see here, it's okay to round, just make sure you double check with your interviewer. So now at this point, you as the interviewee might say, okay, maybe we should now focus on costs, or the interviewer might kind of lead you along and say, okay, now this is where we want to turn to. It just depends on the interview style and how the interviewer likes to conduct their own interviews, but regardless, we're going to move on to costs, and let's say the interviewer asks you to brainstorm what factors might contribute to costs. And so if you want to take a second, pause the video, think yourself. I know the answers are there, but maybe try not to look at them. And then we can resume whenever you hit play. But for now, I'll just go ahead and keep going. So possible answers to factors that might contribute to costs are cost of goods sold. So this is often abbreviated as COGS. It's very common, so you might want to be familiar with that abbreviation. And that's just cost of things like fabric. And I guess that's it, like fabric, embellishments, like buttons, things like that, anything that's required to make the goods that you're selling. Next would be rent, so rent for any type of store that they have, maintenance of the store, labor cost, and utilities. So next, the interviewer tells you that the company's total U.S. annual cost is $7.5 million. And so should this case have been a little bit harder, they might have said, why don't you market size our costs for us and try to estimate, our total cost. But in this case, they were a little bit nice. So they gave you it, the 7.5 million. And at this point, with that information, you should be able to make the conclusion that the company is making annual losses of $500,000. So now the interviewer asks you to brainstorm ways that Unicloth can cut these losses. And so remember, an ideal answer would be very comprehensive, and so you want to look at ways to both increase revenue and decrease cost. And so examples of doing this would include, on the cost side, cheaper manufacturing or shipping, cutting rent by moving to a smaller store or a cheaper location, sharing rent with another business, so maybe having a coffee shop within the business and then they split the rent with you, and then cutting labor. And so when I say cutting labor, and I put an asterisk there just because this one is always a slightly iffy recommendation to make, especially because companies don't like the idea of cutting labor. It's often very bad PR for the company. And so you want to make sure whenever you give that recommendation, should you give that recommendation, you always make the point to say that it's very risky to do so. This could have a bad implication on the brand. In terms of the revenue side, so training the sales staff to increase units sold, this would be a huge increase in revenue for them. Decreasing the prices of goods, if that's possible. Incorporating promotions to increase the volume of units sold, provided that this would increase revenue as well. And then new or improved marketing could increase revenue. Other ideas could be surveying US customers, seeing if this Asian clothing brand is actually providing products that people in the US want to buy. It can be anything, even a little bit more specific than that. Feel free to include kind of your own spin on things and get creative here. Usually this interview is given to all of the applicants that a company will see, or at least a lot of them, and so they've heard these answers over and over again, and to provide something unique will definitely make you stand out. So to wrap up the case, the interviewer now tells you the CEO of Unicloth has walked in and would like to hear your recommendation. And so the way a recommendation works is you want to be very concise but also very solid in what you're saying, and make sure that you hit all the main points that you and the interviewer have discovered throughout this case. And so the way a recommendation should be set up is first you want to state your overall recommendation. Start off with what exactly the CEO should do. Let's say the CEO doesn't have a lot of time on their hands. Even if they hear this one line, they should be understanding what you have come up with from the case. And so in our case, it would be, Unicloth should follow these 3 or 4 steps in order to increase revenue and in turn increase profit. And so then what you want to do is state the factors that drove you to make this recommendation. So here you want to talk a little bit about the math, nothing too crazy because the interviewers already heard everything you've had to say. So very briefly, you can say, their revenue is 7 million, their costs are 7.5 million, and this is annual revenue. And therefore, we know that they're making negative $0.5 million in profit per year. And these are the factors that drove me to make this recommendation. 3, you want to mention any risks associated with your recommendation. And so this is very specific to what you actually decided to recommend. But as the example I gave earlier about cutting labor, this is a very risky move on any company's behalf. And so that could be an interesting risk to mention. And then lastly, you want to mention any next steps the CEO should follow. And so this is again kind of specific to your recommendation, but making sure that these next steps are targeted towards your goal, which in this case is to increase profit. So next we want to go to tips and resources for casing should you want to explore this further. In terms of tips, so first and foremost is math. So as you can see from the mock case, math is a big part of the case interview, making sure that you can do mental math, that you're always paying attention to the units, and that you're very clear about the math that you're doing. Is huge for any case interview, especially because as you're doing this math, the interviewer is probably across from you. They're not usually going to be sitting side by side. So you need to be able to verbalize what you're saying in a very clear way, or verbalize what you're doing in a very clear way in order to make sure that the interviewer knows exactly what you are thinking and is able to follow all of your logic. Next, your recommendation. So we talked about this already with the mock case, so I'm not going to go through it here, but this is again just an outline of how a recommendation should go, and they should usually not be over a minute. When you're stuck, remember to synthesize what you've worked through already, and then say where you should go or what you want to explore further. Remember, there's no shame in asking for help from an interviewer. We're all learning. Worst comes to worst, they might say, we can't help you, we'd like to see how you go through this. That's completely fine. Next, integrate your own experience. As I mentioned, this case interview is probably being given to a bunch of clients, so being able to be unique and creative in your answers is always a really good way to stand out. Next, we're going to move to numbering and bucketing. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but bucketing just means putting things into groups. And so a common term that you might hear is MIEXE, which stands for mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And so this is how you want to categorize your buckets. You don't want them to be repetitive or overlapping. You want to show the interviewer that you are very clear in what you're doing and methodical. Lastly, encountering an exhibit. So this is very common in a case interview. The interviewer will often give you a piece of paper that might have a graph or a table on it, and it's up to you to interpret it to find the relevant information that you may need for the case. And so you always want to talk through what you're examining, making sure that the interviewer knows that you know how to read a graph, you know what the exhibit is comparing, and that you are able to take away some key points from a figure if it was presented in front of you, maybe by a client or by a coworker should you get the job and work at this firm. So lastly, here are some additional resources. I'm just going to briefly go through these. Victor Chang is a 8-hour-long video series. It's very helpful. It's by a former McKinsey consultant. Case in point is a consulting book. It's probably the consulting book, should you find one, and it's all about learning how to case, a little bit more into frameworks, and I think there are some practice cases in there as well. BWIB, of course, is an awesome resource if you want to reach out to exec or the consulting committee for any practice cases or additional resources. Always feel free to do so. And then I've attached a couple links for some case books here, and so these are just books that have additional case prompts in them, and then they also have the answers. So feel free to go through those at your own pace, especially if you're going to be recruiting for a consulting internship in the near future. And then on campus, there's the Bruin Development Academy. It's run by the Career Center, and they have a bunch of them, but there's one specific to consulting. UBS has a consulting workshop that they put on in the spring and fall every year. The spring is for sophomores, and then the fall is for juniors. And then there are a bunch of consulting clubs on campus. I've listed some here. A lot of people in BWIB or on BWIB board are in these consulting clubs, so feel free to reach out if you want to learn a little bit more about each one or if you're interested in recruiting for one of them. So to wrap up, we're going to move into the recruitment timeline. And so in terms of the recruitment cycle, if you are a junior or a senior, recruitment for consulting internships and full-time positions usually happen very early in fall quarter. And by very early, I mean interviews are usually happening within the first 3 weeks of fall quarter. So if you're not already prepared to do a consulting interview and recruit and apply by the time you enter UCLA in your junior or senior year, it's very likely that you'll miss any type of deadlines that might come up. So make sure that you are prepared for that early on. If you're a freshman right now watching this video, ways that you can get involved in the consulting community are trying to recruit for consulting clubs or applying to the Bruin Development Academy. And then as a current sophomore or junior who may be watching this video, it's important to get ready to start casing over the summer, as I said, in preparation for internship and full-time interviews, and also to polish up your resume and cover letter. Unfortunately, something to be aware of given the current situation is that the number of internships and full-time positions that may be available for the next summer and onwards might be a little bit more limited than it has been in the past, just because a lot of companies are not actively recruiting right now. So this is something to just keep in the back of your mind, and we're just going to have to see how it goes. If you have any questions, I know this is pre-recorded so you can't ask them live, but feel free to email BWIB directly. If you have any questions specific for the consulting committee, they will direct you to us. We're here to respond whenever to any questions that you have. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that your week 3 is awesome and that your quarantine is going smoothly. I'll see you guys later.